It started with a single transmission, garbled and faint, crackling across the void of space. To most, it would have been noise, a distortion in the cosmic winds. But to Captain Adrien Holt, it was a lifeline. He stood in the command center of the Sparrow, humanity's last long-range scout frigate, staring at the audio wave flickering across the console. Outside, the infinite black stretched endlessly, dotted by the faintest stars, indifferent and uncaring to the small ship drifting alone in its silence. "Run diagnostics on that signal," Adrien said quietly. He didn't need to shout. The crew of the Sparrow was small, barely a dozen officers left on what had once been a 50-person vessel. Now, the survivors worked with practiced efficiency. They had to. Lieutenant Vera, his second in command, turned her pale face toward him from the console's glow. "Sir, it's not one of ours. Could be Velexar." At the name, the entire command center seemed to freeze. Velexar, humanity's most merciless enemy, the alien race that had swept across systems like a plague. Their warships were monstrous, their soldiers unforgiving. Encounters with the Velexar rarely ended well for humans, especially not a lone frigate like the Sparrow. Adrien ran a hand through his graying hair, his brows furrowed. "Can you clean it up? I need to know what we're dealing with." Vera nodded and worked quickly. After a few tense moments, a voice emerged from the static, deep, guttural, and unmistakably alien. But what it said made Adrien's blood run cold. "Final phase initiated. Humanity's resistance will be extinguished." Adrien stood still, absorbing the words. Final phase. That meant the Velexar weren't just launching an attack. They were ending the war, wiping humanity from existence. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his tired crew, every face telling its own story of loss and exhaustion. "How close is the source of that transmission?" Adrien asked, his voice calm despite the pounding in his chest. "2 systems away, sir," Vera replied. "It's heavily encrypted, but I think I can trace it to a Velexar dreadnought." A dreadnought. The Velexar's apex weapon. Ships the size of cities, capable of reducing planets to ash. Adrien clenched his jaw. "They're coordinating from there," he said quietly. "That's where the order will come from to wipe out Earth." "Captain," Vera said, hesitation clear in her voice. "We can't fight a dreadnought. We don't even have enough firepower to scratch its shields." Adrien turned to her, his eyes blazing with something the crew hadn't seen in weeks: determination. "We're not going to fight it. We're going to stop it." The room went quiet. Some exchanged glances, others stared at Adrien like he'd lost his mind. "Sir," Vera said carefully, "that's impossible. A frigate against a dreadnought. It's suicide." Adrien let out a breath and smiled faintly. "That's what they think. That's what they've always thought. That we're weak, that we give up when the odds are against us. But they don't understand us. They don't know what we're capable of when we're pushed to the brink." Silence hung in the air before a voice spoke up from behind him. It was Lynn, the young systems officer, barely out of the academy. Her voice was soft but firm. "What's the plan, sir?" Adrien turned toward the crew. "We're going to infiltrate that dreadnought and take out their command systems. If we succeed, we buy Earth enough time to launch a counterattack." Vera stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "And if we fail?" Adrien met her gaze. "Then we die knowing we gave humanity a fighting chance." The words hung heavy in the air, but something shifted. The fear that had gripped the crew for so long began to loosen, replaced by a spark of resolve. One by one, they turned back to their stations, faces set with grim determination. The Sparrow burned its engines hot, pushing through the black toward its impossible target. Adrien stood on the bridge, staring at the distant glimmer of the Velexar fleet, his thoughts a whirlwind. They had no reason to believe they could succeed. The odds were beyond impossible. And yet, that was precisely why they had to try. Humanity had come too far, fought too hard, to let this be their end. If the Velexar thought humans would lay down and die quietly, they were in for a surprise. As the Sparrow approached the dreadnought, the crew worked tirelessly. Lynn rewired communication relays to mask their approach. Vera coordinated power systems, pushing the ship to its limits. Adrien watched over them, feeling the weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. "We're entering sensor range," Vera announced. Adrien nodded. "Cut all non-essential systems." Silent running. The lights dimmed as the ship powered down everything but the essentials. They drifted through space like a ghost, the massive silhouette of the dreadnought growing larger in the viewport. It was monstrous, an entire ecosystem of alien death forged into steel. Adrien's gut twisted as he saw the rows of weapon turrets and shield generators. "They're scanning," Lynn whispered. "Hold course," Adrien replied. "Don't breathe. Don't blink." Seconds stretched into eternity. The Sparrow passed the dreadnought's patrol perimeter, slipping into the shadow of the colossal ship. When the scan passed and no alarm sounded, Adrien let out a slow breath. "We're in," Vera said. "Prepare the infiltration team," Adrien ordered. The airlock hissed as Adrien, Vera, and 4 others prepared to breach the dreadnought. They wore vacuum suits and carried rifles, though they knew weapons wouldn't win this fight. Their target was the command hub, deep within the ship, surrounded by Velexar forces. If they could plant explosives on the main control nexus, it would disrupt the dreadnought's ability to coordinate its fleet. "Team, check in," Adrien said. "Ready," Vera replied. "On standby," Lynn whispered, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Let's move," Adrien said. They floated silently through the dark void before landing on the dreadnought's hull. Using magnetic clamps, they climbed toward an auxiliary port. Vera hacked the lock, and the hatch slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the corridors pulsed with a faint green light, alien symbols carved into the walls. The air was thick and humid, a stark contrast to the freezing void they just crossed. Adrien led the way, rifle raised, his boots barely making a sound on the metallic floor. "Stay close," he whispered. The group moved like shadows through the labyrinth of corridors, every corner a potential ambush. Twice they hid as Velexar patrols passed, tall, insect-like beings with chitinous armor and glowing eyes. Adrien held his breath both times, his finger hovering over the trigger, but the patrols passed without incident. Finally, they reached the control hub. The room was massive, a domed chamber filled with conduits of light running along the floor and walls. In the center, a pulsing nexus thrummed with energy, the heart of the dreadnought. "Lynn, plant the charges," Adrien ordered. Lynn hurried forward, her hands steady as she set the explosives. She moved quickly, weaving the detonators through the conduits, her expression a mask of focus. Adrien kept his eyes on the doors, heart hammering in his chest as seconds ticked by. "Halfway there," Lynn whispered. A sound shattered the silence, a deep, resonant thrum that echoed through the chamber. "Movement," Vera hissed, raising her rifle. The doors at the far end slid open, and Velexar soldiers poured in, their glowing eyes locking onto the humans. Adrien fired first, the sharp crack of his rifle splitting the air. The others followed, their shots precise, cutting down the first wave of aliens. But more were coming, dozens of them, chittering and shrieking, their claws scraping against the floor. "Lynn, how much longer?" Adrien shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "I need 2 more minutes," she cried, frantically working. "We don't have 2 minutes," Vera shouted back, firing as another Velexar lunged at them. Adrien gritted his teeth, reloading his rifle. "Hold them back." The team formed a defensive line, firing in controlled bursts as the Velexar advanced. Adrien's mind raced, his focus unshakable. They couldn't fail here. Earth's survival depended on this moment. "Charges set," Lynn shouted, her voice carrying over the din of alien screeches and rifle fire. "We're ready." "Fall back," Adrien roared, his rifle barking one last burst of fire before he turned and grabbed Lynn by the arm. The team scrambled toward the corridor they had entered from, the Velexar hot on their heels. Energy blasts seared past them, scorching the walls as the aliens pursued with terrifying speed. Vera threw a smoke charge behind them. The corridor filled with thick white vapor, cutting off the aliens' line of sight and buying them precious seconds. Adrien led the way, his boots pounding against the metal floor as he pulled Lynn along. "Get to the airlock," Adrien barked, his voice ragged with urgency. "Captain, they're closing in," Vera shouted, firing a blind shot back through the smoke. Adrien ignored the burn in his lungs, the sharp ache in his legs. Failure was not an option. They burst into the auxiliary chamber where they'd entered, slamming the airlock panel as they crowded into the hatch. The metal door hissed and began to close, too slowly. Adrien turned back to see the Velexar emerging from the smoke, their glowing eyes burning with malice. One of the soldiers aimed a pulsating weapon at the hatch, its barrel glowing ominously. "Take cover," Adrien shouted, pulling Lin down just as the Velexar weapon fired. The energy blast slammed into the edge of the hatch, sending sparks and debris cascading. But it was too late. The door sealed shut, cutting them off from the pursuing aliens. "We're sealed," Vera confirmed, panting heavily as she secured her helmet. "Launch us back to the Sparrow," Adrien ordered. "Lin, detonate the charges the moment we're clear." Lin nodded, her hand hovering over the detonator trigger. Adrien activated his suit thrusters, propelling himself and the others off the dreadnought's hull into the void of space. The Velexar behemoth loomed behind them, its dark silhouette filling their view like a malevolent god. Adrien didn't dare look back for too long. "Status?" he asked over comms. "We're clear," Vera shouted. "Lin," Adrien said, his voice steady. "Do it." Lin closed her eyes for the briefest moment, her finger pressing the detonator. A flash of blinding white erupted from the dreadnought's core. Adrien's visor darkened automatically, but even through the filter, the explosion was immense, a ball of fire and light that expanded outward like a supernova. The shockwave hit them moments later, jostling their suits as debris scattered through space. Adrien turned back, his breath catching as he watched the dreadnought tear itself apart. The pulse from the explosives had destabilized its command systems, and now secondary detonations spread like wildfire through the ship. It buckled and cracked, massive sections of its armor breaking away and spinning into the void. "We did it," Lin whispered, her voice trembling with awe and disbelief. "We're not out of this yet," Adrien said, though even he couldn't suppress the flicker of hope in his chest. "Get to the Sparrow. Move." The crew tumbled back into the Sparrow's airlock one by one, their bodies aching and adrenaline still coursing through their veins. Adrien pulled off his helmet, the stale ship air filling his lungs, and leaned against the bulkhead. "Report," he said, though the exhaustion was clear in his voice. Vera stumbled to her console and ran diagnostics. "The dreadnought is gone. Completely destroyed. Scans show Velexar fleet movements have stopped. They're uncoordinated." Adrien let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping with relief. "They relied too much on that command ship," he muttered. "Without it, they're blind." Lin grinned, tears streaking her cheeks as she slumped into her seat. "We did it. We actually did it." The crew erupted into cheers and shouts, the weight of their mission finally lifting. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, there was laughter aboard the Sparrow. Adrien watched them, pride swelling in his chest. Humanity wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Hours later, the Sparrow drifted at the edge of the system, its engines idling as the crew prepared for their next steps. Adrien sat in the captain's chair, staring at the viewport. The black void stretched out before him, but now it felt a little less empty. Vera approached him quietly. "Captain," she said, "Earth is hailing us. They're receiving scattered reports of the dreadnought's destruction. Command wants to know if it's true." Adrien smiled faintly. "Patch me through." The screen flickered to life, and a general appeared. A gruff man with deep lines carved into his face, worn down by years of war. "Captain Holt," the general said, his voice gravelly. "Report." "General," Adrien said, sitting up straighter. "The dreadnought has been destroyed. Velexar forces in the sector are in disarray. Earth has a window to launch a counterattack." The general stared at him, his expression unreadable, as if struggling to process the words. "How?" Adrien glanced back at his crew, their tired faces now alight with hope. "Because, sir," he said with a smile, "humans don't know how to quit." The general's stern face softened, and a rare smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Understood, Captain. You've done your people proud. Return to Earth. Reinforcements will meet you halfway. We'll take it from here. The screen went dark, and Adrien sat back in his chair. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he allowed himself to relax. The war wasn't over, but today had proven something. Humanity would fight until the end, no matter the odds. Vera sat beside him, staring out into the void. "Do you think they'll remember this day?" she asked softly. Adrien smiled faintly. "They will, because this is the day we reminded the galaxy who we are." And as the Sparrow turned toward Earth, its engines humming softly in the quiet, Adrien looked out into the vastness of space with a quiet, unshakable belief. Humanity would endure. Humanity would fight. And in the face of impossible odds, they would win.